So good to see all of you this morning for our Sunday morning Bible class. We're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 8, right at the first few verses there in Matthew chapter 8. So we invite your attention there, and we're going to talk about today Jesus, the great healer and helper. Now, we've started in chapter 1. We've sort of moved our way through. Now, I just want to ask some questions as some reminders before we begin. If you were to say that Matthew is trying to accomplish something in his book, what is he trying to accomplish through his writing? What is he trying to tell the audience? That's a tough question, isn't it? Let's picture it this way. Let's say, what is he using as his method to prove that Jesus is the Messiah? The Old Testament Scriptures. Definitely so. So what he's trying to do is, he's trying to convince a Jewish audience that Jesus is really who he said he is. And what he does is, he refers to the Old Testament Scriptures a lot. So I'm guessing, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16 times already, we have seen the phrase that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. Okay, so this is over and over and over again. Let's see, I think I remember I saw this in chapter 8. Look at chapter 8, verse 17. That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses. So, yes, over and over, he's using the Old Testament Scriptures to prove that Jesus is who he said he is. Now, in the first few verses of Matthew chapter 8, we're going to talk about Jesus healing a man who has leprosy. Now, can you think of any people in the Bible who had leprosy? Naaman. Yeah, 2 Kings chapter 5. Who said that? Miriam. That's right, Moses' sister. She had leprosy. In fact, Miriam was given leprosy by who? By God. All right? She was given leprosy by God because of her disobedience. All right, can you think of any others? There's one man I always think about who was the greatest man of the East, but he lost everything. Job. But you know, I was looking at Job's situation, and it's funny to me that the Bible does not call what he had leprosy. I thought that was interesting. It said that he was smitten with sore boils from the top of his head to his feet. Now, most likely, I believe that was leprosy, but I wonder why. Why did the Bible not say? Anyway, I don't know why. We'll probably never find out. But all right, I want to notice one that you don't normally think about. Okay, and in fact, I'll notice a couple. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 21. Now, unless you've read the Bible all the way through, you may not even read about this man. Okay, we don't ever talk about him, but he was one of the kings of Judah. His name was Uzziah. Let's talk about him just for a minute. Now, while you're there, I'm going to sort of lead up to this, okay? And we'll talk about leprosy just for a minute to help you understand before we go back to Matthew 8 what's really going on with this man who has leprosy. Now, in Leviticus chapter 13, there were some laws given by God about diseases, and leprosy is one of them. So here's what he said. The priest shall look upon the plague, the skin of the flesh, and when the hair in the plague is turned white, and the plague in the sight it be deeper than the skin, it is the plague of leprosy. Okay, so he begins to describe this. He said, if it's deeper than the skin, but the hair is not white, he has to stay there with the priest for 7 more days. But immediately, if the sore is deeper than the skin and the hair is white, he knows immediately that's leprosy. Now that describes to me what this sore is like. It is literally an open wound, like rotting flesh. Now that's pretty sore, isn't it? You know, I don't know, I guess I sort of have things that bother me pretty easily sometimes, and You ever have like a cut on your finger and you didn't realize it, but all throughout the day, like every time you put your hand in your pocket, you knew it was there? You're like, oh, well, that's pretty annoying. Then you try to do something about it, and then you hit it on something later, make it worse, and then it starts bleeding, and then the next day it's all swollen, so then you're putting your hand in your pocket all throughout the day, and then it's just worse. To me, it's little things like that are kind of annoying, but I just can't even imagine like an open wound on your arm and your shirt is rubbing against it all day. Or open wounds all over your body. I mean, you literally are walking like you're sunburned, all day long. And that's what these people are doing. He continues, he said, if the bright spot be white in the skin of his flesh, and the sight be not deeper than the skin, and the hair thereof not be turned white, then the priest shall shut up him that hath the plague for 7 days. So he's going to keep an eye on him, make sure he's not spreading this thing. Now, if you have something that is on your skin that is not deeper than the skin, what would we normally call that? A little bit itchy, burns. Sometimes maybe like a skin disease, eczema, or just a sore. So this is definitely worse and different. Chapter 13, verse 20, it said, the priest shall look, and if it appears deeper than the skin, the hair is turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the case of a leprous disease that has broken out into the boil. So it's getting worse. And it's not good. Okay. Now I've got to ask you this question. Now that we know what this is, how painful this is, what is the significance in Matthew chapter 8 when it says a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, canst make me clean. And Jesus put forth his hand and touched him. Why is that significant? You can't touch a leper. In fact, you're not supposed to be anywhere near one if you're a Jew. Nobody is supposed to be around him because he can spread this disease. It's interesting in the Old Testament how God made these rules, like they couldn't eat pork and things like that. We think that God's trying to cramp their lifestyle, but that's not the case. Pork carries some very dangerous diseases like trichinosis. And pigs, they eat all kind of nasty stuff. I mean, they're just eating everything off the ground. God wanted them to eat animals that eat grass. You see? Healthy animals. Okay? So the reason why God is making these stipulations about lepers and saying you can't come near them is not because God didn't like leprosy. And it's not because God didn't like the person who had it. It's because God didn't want it to be spread around the camp. All right, so what did they have to do then? What did the lepers have to do? Yes, ma'am. If anybody walked around them, they had to cover their mouth. Okay, they're not spreading germs. And say, unclean, unclean. And then the people that would come near them, they're like, oh. That's a terrible way to live, isn't it? Have you ever had your child come home from school and maybe they made a bad grade or something, or something happened where they got embarrassed and they cried and they said that people were making fun of them? Manna came home the other day and it just broke my heart. She has trouble reading and she has dyslexia, so it's hard for her. And we've gotten her all the help that she can have. We've got her a tutor that she goes to every week, and it just tore me up because that night she was doing her homework and reading this little book she has for class, and she cried and she said, all of the people in my class can read chapter books, and I can't read chapter books. She said, I have to pretend like I know how to read chapter books when I really can't. I called my wife and told her she was out of town in St. Louis, and I told her, I said, you're not going to believe what man told me tonight. It was terrible. We both just cried. You know, because people generally want to be accepted, and especially when they're children. You think about how these people felt when, you know, all they want to do is give their spouse a hug or walk up to their children and look them in the eyes and hug their necks. But not only can they not do that, they're literally an outcast to everyone. They have to live outside the gates of the city. And if they have to just come in the city to get some groceries or something, if they come around anyone, they have to say, unclean, unclean. So how do you think this man felt when he begged Jesus to make him clean? And it's interesting, the Holy Spirit chose to reveal this part to us. It says Jesus reached forth his hand and he touched him. Probably the first time anybody had touched this man in years. Well, you read about this in Numbers chapter 12. Miriam, we mentioned her a little bit earlier. It says there was a cloud removed from over the tent. This is the tabernacle. Now, she got all upset and basically was rebellious. And God told Aaron and Miriam and Moses, you meet me at the gate of the tabernacle. So the cloud was removed from over the tent. Behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam. Behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, Oh, my Lord, do not punish us, because we have done foolishly and have sinned. Let her not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb. Now that tells me how bad this is. This disease is absolutely a misery. So when we think about Job, we think about Naaman, Miriam, this king, Uzziah, that we're going to read about in just a minute, I have an idea that these people would rather be dead than to experience this disease. All right, let's go to 2 Chronicles 26. Okay? 2 Chronicles 26. I want to ask someone to read verses 16 through 19. Okay, 2 Chronicles 26, 16 through 19. Let's talk about King Uzziah for a minute, who had leprosy.
But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. So as arrived, the priests went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. You shall have no honor from the Lord God. Then Uzziah became furious, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord, beside the incense altar.
Okay. What was supposed to happen to King Uzziah? There was a punishment in the Old Testament. If any unauthorized man went into the tabernacle, what was supposed to happen to him? He was supposed to die. But God was merciful on this man, and sad to say, he was merciful enough to give him leprosy. You say, well, man, that's not being merciful. Well, he was supposed to die right there on the spot. But it says his leprosy broke out on his forehead. In verse 20, and Azariah the chief priest and all the priests, they looked upon him. Behold, he was leprous in his forehead. They thrust him out from thence, and himself hasted also to go out, because the Lord had smitten him. Uzziah the king was a leper until the day of his death. He dwelt in several houses, being a leper. He was cut off from the house of the Lord, and Jotham his son was king over his house. judging the people of the land. So from that moment on, he was an outcast to society. So, we've got a disease that is deeper than the skin, which is an open wound. We have a disease that covers people from head to toe. We have a disease that is described as half-eaten flesh. Okay? In Numbers chapter 12, when it says, whose flesh is half eaten away. And it says, if a man has this, he is as good as dead. So, in Matthew chapter 8, when Jesus healed this man, this is a huge life changer for this man. I mean, we're not talking about battling cancer, and I understand that cancer is a terrible disease and people are very, very sick. But I'm talking about a disease that puts people in misery from the time they go to bed, if they're even able to sleep, all throughout the day. It's miserable. All right. There are several other things I wanted to notice here. Let's look here in the latter part of the section in verse 4. Jesus made him clean, verse 3. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. But Jesus said to him, see thou tell no man, but go thy way and show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony to them. Why in the world do you think Jesus would tell him, don't tell anybody?
I don't think he meant never tell anybody. I think he was going back to what we talked about in Leviticus 13. You got to go see the priest, let him decide whether he's clean or not.
Sure enough, that's true. There are several reasons, in my opinion, why. That's one of them, yes, because he even said, you need to go to the priest first, make sure he agrees that everything is gone, okay, and then you can go back home to your family. Now, that's one reason, too. But let's go to Mark 1:45. Okay, I think there's a little bit of insight here as to why. Because sometimes Jesus told them to go and tell them. You know, there were other occasions where Jesus healed people and he said, I want you to go and tell people about this. But on this occasion, he's trying to accomplish something. Number one, I definitely agree with Tim. He needs to go see the priest. Number two, he's got to accomplish a few more things. Okay? Let's see here. Same account, Mark chapter 1, verse 44. He said, see thou say nothing to any man. This is the same leper, just Mark is the one writing about it this time. Go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing those which Moses commanded for a testimony to them. Now here it is. But he went out and began to publish it much. He did exactly what Jesus told him not to do. He couldn't help it. You know, he was excited. And to blaze abroad the matter, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city, but was without in desert places, and they came to him from every quarter. You see, Jesus was trying to go and minister in the city, and he said, look, let's keep it quiet for right now. Okay, we'll let this blow up in just a little while, but at least let me get in there and do some teaching first. Well, he began to tell everybody, and then Jesus couldn't accomplish what he was wanting to by going into the city. So, you know, there were times when I wondered, like, why didn't he tell him? And to me, some commentaries and a little bit of research just sort of easily clears that up. All right, any question or comment before we go on? Okay, let's go back to Matthew 8, talk about another man. This chapter deals with Jesus, a healer and a helper, and we'll meet someone else in verse 5. Okay? All right. Okay. When Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came to him a centurion beseeching him and saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. Now, Capernaum is sort of significant, and Jesus did a lot of work in this area. Now, I failed to mention this earlier, but when you come to Matthew chapter 8, this is literally the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Okay? It is a continuation from the end of chapter 4. Okay? You look at the end of Matthew chapter 4. Verse 24, his fame throughout all Syria, they went abroad unto him, sick people that were taken, diverse diseases and torments, and those were possessed of devils, those that were lunatic, those that had the palsy, and he healed them. So he began his ministry there at the end of chapter 4, but Matthew takes a break. He introduces the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. So then when you come to chapter 8, what you're doing is you're reading about the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So the first two, one is a leper and the other is paralyzed. Okay. Now Capernaum is north of the Sea of Galilee. It's right on the shore. Now there were some apostles who were from here. Can you think of who was there? Matthew chapter 4. There were two men who were fishing in the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus was walking and he saw them fishing. One is Simon Peter and who? And Andrew, his brother. They were from this area. Okay? Now, they, of course, were the general area, but at any rate, they were from this general area north of the Sea of Galilee. All right, so when Jesus is in Capernaum, he sees a centurion. What's a centurion? A commander of 100 men. Is this a Jew or a Gentile? It's a Gentile. It's pretty amazing that the news spreads quickly. And Jesus is supposed to be really ministering to the Jewish people. But this Gentile man comes to him and he recognizes Jesus for who he is. And Jesus commends him for that. In fact, I think Jesus is a little bit taken back by what he seems to say about it. But yes, he said, I will come. All right, so this man has a palsy. He is grievously tormented. Jesus said, I will come and heal him. But look at verse 8. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. Now, this centurion man obviously cares about this man that has worked for him probably his whole life. When you wanted a job in the first century, you couldn't go down to the local grocery store and apply, put in an application. No, you would go to people in the community who were wealthy, and you would say, look, I need a job. And they'd say, well, good, because I need some help. And they would hire you. So this centurion hired this man, and this man had been working for him probably for a long, long time, and he loved this man. The man became sick, and he wanted to get him some help. Look at verse 9. He said, I am a man under authority, the centurion. I have soldiers under me, and I say to this man, go, and he goes. I say to another, come, and he comes. He said, and my servant, I tell him to do this, and he does it. But when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said, verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. That's significant because this man is not even an Israelite. And Jesus said, now look, this guy is probably not even religious, but he knows where to go to find help for his problem. And he came to Jesus. All right. There's several things I want to notice along that line. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'll notice a couple of things and then move on. Capernaum is a very significant place. Now, when I look at this synagogue, this is a ruin of an old Jewish synagogue. In my opinion, from my study, I believe that Jesus stood right there and taught people. The Bible says that he taught people in the synagogue in Capernaum. Now, that's pretty neat to think. There's a high possibility, in my opinion, I'd say probably 90% sure. I'm probably 90% sure that Jesus stood right there and taught people in that room. That's absolutely amazing. Let's go to John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verses 32 through 35. I'll notice this and then I'll move on. Capernaum is also the place where, if you remember, there was a man who was paralyzed who was let down in a roof. Do you remember that? That's in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and Luke chapter 5, verses 17 through 26. This is not the same man, by the way, but they're in the same town. They're two different accounts. All right, well, somebody read John chapter 6, verses 32 through 35, and then I'll move on. John chapter 6 is another one of those great sermon moments for Jesus. Sermon on the Mount? Yes. But John chapter 6 is some of the most powerful words, and I love this statement where Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Where did he say that? The very end of the chapter. These things said he in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Whew. It's pretty neat to think that could really be it. Well, Capernaum is a very valuable place. That's where Jesus began his ministry and things like that. He did a lot of work there. All right, let's go on. Let's go to verse 14. Matthew chapter 8, verse 14. Let's talk about Peter's mother-in-law who was healed, and then we'll close with this. Jesus was coming to Peter's house. Okay, this is still in the same general area. Okay, Capernaum. Came into Peter's house, and when he saw his wife's mother laid sick of a fever, he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and ministered unto them. When even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed of the devils, and cast out the spirits with his word, and healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses. Okay, so really that's the point he's trying to make. Now, he's not just telling us about the leper and the man who was paralyzed and healing. Those are great things. But Matthew's trying to nail a point with his hammer, okay? He's trying to really hit something home here. This is Jesus the Christ that was prophesied about in the Old Testament. He's saying, look, I told you. He will heal these people. He will do these great things. And even the Old Testament scriptures say that he was going to do this stuff. So then he concludes that section there with that statement that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. Now, let's talk about Peter's mother-in-law just for a moment. And wanted to share something with you. Now, what is significant as far as Peter goes and Catholicism? What do they believe about Peter? Okay, they believe, number one, that he wasn't married, that he was the first pope. Okay. Now, they base this position on Matthew 16:18. So let's go to Matthew 16:18 just for a minute, and we'll talk about this, and then we'll close. Matthew is the only gospel writer that uses the word church, and he only uses it one time. And it's right here in Matthew 16:18. Okay? Now, they say the kingdom of heaven is at hand, all these things, but they never use the word church. Only Matthew does. And he uses it one time. Okay, in this section right here in Matthew 16:18. Will somebody read that for us? All right, we read verse 19 as well, sorry.
And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth is bound on earth. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed.
All right, so here's the doctrine in Catholicism. They say, Peter was the first pope, and they'll take you right here, and they say, see, I told you so. Because Jesus said to Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and they say, the word Peter means rock. And Jesus said, on this rock, I will build my church. Now, that presents a problem. Because any basic grammar student in Greek grammar can notice a big problem right at the start. Number one, the word rock for Peter and the word rock that Jesus used are two different words. They come from the same root, but they are very much different. Petros, Peter, it means a stone. Okay, you can pick it up and throw it. But when Jesus said, upon this Petra, I will build my church, that's not a stone. All right? You can't even pick it up. It is literally a foundation. Upon this foundation, that's what Jesus is saying. Upon this Petra, I will build my church. Now, I'm just curious what you're thinking here. What are your views and how that could not be the case? What's going on here? Okay, yeah, Jesus was going to build the church. And Jesus said to Peter, I'll give you the keys to it, but I'm going to build it. That's right. That's a very good observation there. Now, when I think about this also, I think about what the rock is. When Jesus said, on this rock, you go back to the verse before it. When Peter stood up and said, when Jesus asked him, who do you say that I am? Peter jumped up and he said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said, you are exactly right. And on this rock, on the rock that I am who you said I am, I'm going to build my church. So, when you put it all in its context, I think there's a confusion there about what the rock is. The rock is the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. The rock is not Peter, all right? So that creates a problem. I'll share this with you. It's an article that I found. I've got just a couple minutes left here. It says, St. Matthew recorded in the Gospel that Jesus entered to Peter's house and found Peter's mother-in-law in bed with a fever. He took her by the hand and the fever left her. Matthew 18, 14 to 15. Note that the passage does not mention Peter's wife, but only his mother-in-law. I'm like, really? This is from a Catholic website. The Gospels, however, make no mention of St. Peter's wife, living or non-living, and therefore St. Peter's wife must have died before Jesus called him to be an apostle. For full disclosure, Clement of Alexandria said that St. Peter was married, had children, and witnessed his wife's martyrdom in Rome. These points were recorded, citing Clement and Eusebius in the history of the church. Given the silence of other church fathers about Peter's wife and children, and the lack of any archaeological evidence of ancient Rome, which holds the burial site for Peter and so many other early martyrs, one can conclude St. Peter's wife died before he had been called an apostle. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to explain this thing away. Because they know in their doctrines that the Pope cannot marry, which is something that they came up with. That's not biblical, by the way. It's not biblical for one to abstain from marriage unless they're not allowed to marry. Religiously. Now, they can choose not to marry if they want to, but for religious reasons, the Bible doesn't talk about that. So, there's some problems, you know. We think, wait a minute, could Peter be the first pope? Well, Peter was married. Popes can't marry. You don't read about popes in the Bible. In fact, you read about something far different than what is the church leadership in that denomination. So it creates quite an issue there. All right, any question or comment before we go on? Uh-huh.
Chapter 18, verse 15, it seems that he says most of that to all of his disciples.
Okay.
What you bind on earth will be bound.
Okay. All right. That's a good point. So basically, Jesus says, I'm the one in charge, right? And I'm giving you the power to do this because what you bind on earth will already be bound in heaven. Yeah, that's a very good point. Jesus is the one who is the head. All right, what were you going to say?
I was just going to mention after Peter was an apostle, he became an elder. The elder's supposed to be the husband of one wife. Children.
That's a good point. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, and for his qualification in the eldership, he would have had to be married. Yep, rightfully so. It's a good point. And being in an eldership, he has to be part of a group, doesn't he? An elder can't be an elder by himself, not biblically. And that's what the Pope does. He tries to be an elder all by himself. All right, these are very good observations. I appreciate that. We'll pick up next time in Matthew chapter 8, and we'll quit about a minute earlier. So thank you so much.